Climate justice is climate justice is the issue that is present in every negotiation. As long as you have two unequal partners on the table talking about one common thing, then climate justice is always there, whether explicit or implicitly, because if someone thinks that I need to have, I need to have this outcome reflect my needs, then that is how climate justice starts. And so every discussion at the COP will have climate justice in the background, where countries will want to have their best interests addressed in those negotiations. And so there's a few themes that the COP26 presidency has prioritized for the COP. One of them is on loss and damage. Another one is on climate finance. There's adaptation and resilience, and there is what else is there? There's climate finance itself, adaptation and resilience, and net zero. Yeah, net zero transitions. So before I go into that, climate justice, in essence, is like I mentioned earlier, there's an inequality between those who caused climate change and those who are suffering from the effects of climate change. Specifically, rich countries caused climate change, but they've created so much wealth for themselves that if there is a flood, or there's a hurricane, or there's a landslide, they have the capacity they can mobilize resources and protect their communities against it. Poor countries did not cause climate change, and if there is a landslide or a flood, they cannot mobilize those resources because they are poorer as compared to the rich countries. And so climate justice is trying to say that those who are least responsible to climate change are being negative, they're being adversely affected, they're getting more impacts as compared to those who are responsible for climate change. And so a climate justice approach would make sure that those who are least responsible but more affected receive the support they need to protect themselves against climate change. But then in the background of that, but also not parallel to that, climate justice also advocates for action to make sure that these, the cause of climate change, whatever is causing climate change, is limited, so that we're mitigating emissions, but also we're trying to ensure that we're not making it worse. And so we will see some of these themes emerging in loss and damage. For example, loss and damage is trying to say that climate change is causing different losses and damages to communities. And so discussions will be, how can we make sure that whatever support is there acknowledges these losses and damages, but also in a way, in a very simplistic way, reimburses or protects these people from the losses that they incur. Is as opposed, loss, and that is a very large agenda under it. It's how do we define losses and damages? How is that different from the impacts of climate change? How is that different from adaptation and resilience? And who should do it? And when you see that, when you're thinking about what is it and whose responsibility is it, that's where you see climate justice. In net zero, there's discussions about having efforts or policies or approaches that ensure that we move towards a state, an economic and a social state where socioeconomic state where the amount of carbon we're releasing into the atmosphere is less or equal to the amount of carbon we're taking out. And so net zero is about policies to reduce emissions, but also to capture carbon from the atmosphere. And so climate justice will feature in this in relation to who is paying for these carbon reduction efforts or policies or approaches. How much should people do? How much should countries do? How much should regions do? How much should firms do? But also, how do we make sure that while we're moving to that net zero future where we have renewable energy or we have forests, how do we make sure that we're not stripping communities of, we're not taking communities' lands, or we're not planting trees over religious sites, or we're not making people lose their jobs? And so those are climate justice discussions that will feature into discussions on net zero. Adaptation and resilience is, how do we make sure that support that's being offered to those who are affected by climate change are those who actually affected? Because there's research, there's evidence that's been coming out that shows that whatever we've been doing for the last 10 or 20 years has not been benefiting those who are actually affected by climate change. And in even worst case scenarios, those who are affected by climate change have their states being made worse. They end up being worse than before they got the support. For example, there's research that in Mozambique, you know, there's research that found that the relocation of communities from floodplains was moving these households to places where they just did not have any other income. And so if you don't have an income, then it means that if you have a problem, you just do not have savings, you have nothing to fall back on. And so you're kind of more vulnerable to these effects of climate change. So in case there's another flood, you're just there. You have nothing to help protect you against these climate change effects. And so that's resilience. Who is it benefiting? How do we make sure that whatever we're doing to protect communities from these climate change effects is benefiting those who are most affected? And then lastly is climate finance, which weaves into all this. Climate finance is who pays for it? Where do we get the support? How do we make sure that this support gets there? How do we make sure that it's effective, that it does not make people worse off? And how much do we actually need? And so you see climate justice featuring into all this, into all debates. And in some cases it will, it will be more pronounced. People will be like climate justice, but then in some other cases it will be very implicit. When someone tries to advocate for the needs of their country or the needs of their groups or the needs of their households, then that is climate justice in play.